Okay, this lecture we're going to be talking about the brain and consciousness. So we'll be talking about sleep, the waves associated with sleep, some of the possible theories associated with dreaming. We'll touch a little bit on motivational factors and emotion. So in terms of states of consciousness, we're referring to whether a person is awake, asleep, or in a coma, etc. This state can be determined by observing a person's behavior or by watching or measuring their electrical activity in the brain. And we can measure this activity through the use of an EEG. And we won't actually get the opportunity to measure EEGs in this class, but this is a technique used in labs to, like we said, kind of monitor individuals' brain waves and some other functions as well, which we'll get to in here in a second. But do keep in mind that, consciousness, when determined by observing a person's behavior, is very much subjective in nature. So this is certainly on a continuum, and there isn't necessarily like a black or a white area in terms of what we would consider your level of consciousness. Okay, so here is an EEG. Again, we're looking at amplitude in relation to time, and we're looking at the waves to determine how tall they are, how spread out they are, and so on and so forth. I'm certainly not an expert on reading this particular type of lab printout, but this is something that specialized doctors would use to measure consciousness within the brain. So what do we use the EEG for? EEGs are used to detect wave patterns that are abnormal over diseased or damaged brain areas. So we can look at tumors, we can look at blood clots or hemorrhages, again, which could mean that this individual has a stroke. We could look at regions of dead tissue or high or low blood sugar, so it could be used to determine, if someone is getting enough sugar to their brain or not, and so on and so forth. So we can use this in a variety of areas in the brain to help us determine where the blood clot's located, where the hemorrhage is located, where the dead tissue is located, and so on. Shifts from less synchronized pattern of electrical activity from low amplitude EEG to a highly synchronized pattern can be measured when we are looking for an epileptic seizure. So a variety of uses for the EEG in terms of finding different issues within the diseased or damaged brain. Also, possibly as a way for us to predict an epileptic seizure in particular people that are predisposed to have those types of issues. Again, kind of as I mentioned in the previous slide, consciousness is certainly going to be among a continuum. There is certainly some subjectivity associated with understanding what level or form of consciousness you are in. Some forms occur simultaneously, so daydreaming occurs when you're aroused and awake. Again, you don't necessarily think about the decision to start daydreaming. It just kind of happens on its own. Drowsiness, again, is not something that we can consciously decide when to be or when not to be. I know for me, every time I get in the car and drive, and if it's nighttime, I am automatically feeling drowsy. Again, I can't necessarily control that. I can certainly predict when it's going to happen. I know that it happens to me when I get in the car at night, especially if I didn't get a good night's sleep the night before or something. But I certainly can't control it. Dreaming, again, occurs spontaneously. We don't have any control over what we dream or when we dream or how frequently we dream or anything else related to that. But those are going to occur spontaneously. Okay. Some are physiologically induced. So hallucinations, we can experience these when we're on certain drugs. People that have been, stuck in the desert for several days report having hallucinations pretty commonly. And again, that could be due to dehydration, a lack of sugar, and those types of things. An orgasm would be physiologically induced. Food or oxygen starvation, again, would cause some conscious changes. Again, that could possibly lead to hallucinations and other factors as well, particularly, as I mentioned, dehydration or something along those lines. Okay. Some are psychologically induced, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and meditation are all things that we can consciously or psychologically induce upon ourselves. So again, meditation might be a state of consciousness when you're praying, when you're at church, when you are, if you do meditation, if you do yoga, something along those lines would help to get you in this meditated state of mind. This idea of selective attention, our conscious awareness processes only a small part of what we are actually experiencing. So we intuitively make use of the information that we are not consciously aware of. So again, think about what's going on around you right now. So I'm sitting in my kitchen, and visually I am looking at the computer screen as I talk. I'm also looking at my notes so that I make sure that I hit all the points that I need to talk to you about. Also going on around me, my dog is laying on the floor. There's cars going by outside on the street. It's a little bit rainy out, so I can certainly sense the rain out of my peripheral vision as well. Otherwise, I can definitely see out of the corner of my eyes the different areas of my kitchen, like the fruit bowl sitting over there, and there's wine on my wine rack across the way. So visually, I am receiving all this different stimuli at any given time, but I can selectively decide to focus on the screen. I can selectively decide to focus on my notes. If, for example, something changes, like my dog gets up and starts running around, that can certainly distract me and take away my focus. But for now, I am pretty good at being able to just be focused in on a small part of what I am actually experiencing. Same is true with all your other senses as well. Vision is just probably the easiest for us to comprehend. But let's talk about touch, for example. So here I am sitting here trying to focus on this lecture. I'm sitting on a chair, so I have pressure receptors in the backs of my legs that I can feel the chair underneath me. I also have a t-shirt on and my hair in a ponytail, so I can certainly feel the pressure associated with those items that are touching me. Again, I can kind of block those things out as background as I kind of focus directly my attention on what I'm doing. Again, sense of smell. It's 7:30 in the morning. I'm drinking a cup of coffee, so I can certainly smell the coffee. It's raining out, so I can kind of smell that as well. But we're actually very, very good at being able to block out information that we don't perceive as important to us at this given time. Again, we can be distracted fairly easily. My phone's sitting here, so if I happen to get a text message or some sort of alert on my phone, that will certainly distract me, and I'll probably press pause on the recording and take the time to look and see what the message is or what the notification is or whatever it is. So I want you to stop your lecture now for just a second and click on this YouTube video and watch this YouTube video. So this is an experiment that was completed in 1999, and it's on selective attention. So I want you to stop and do the experiment and not go forward in the slideshow until you've done so. So once you've finished that, go ahead and move on to slide number 8. So hopefully you have not seen this experiment done before. I know, if you've taken a psychology class, it's certainly likely that you've seen this experiment before. But this is called inattentional blindness. And inattentional blindness refers to the ability to see an object or not see an object in our midst. So it's an inability to see an object or person that's right within our midst. So in this particular study, they have all these people passing a ball around, and you're supposed to see how many times the ball is passed. And over half, or around half, of the observers failed to see this gorilla person in the middle of the ball game. So again, kind of an interesting study that we missed something so big as a stinking gorilla walking through the middle of an experiment. But again, the reason that this study is kind of interesting is it really demonstrates our strong ability to be able to block out what we think is unimportant. So for example, in this particular scenario, we're so focused on seeing the ball and seeing how many times it's passed from person to person that we are able to block out this additional character throughout this test. So again, I'd just like to kind of reiterate how cool it is that we actually have the opportunity to block out things that we don't think are important. People that have ADD are not good at this. So they are much more hypersensitive to all their senses, which leads them to be very easily distracted. So for example, I described kind of the things going on around me at this time. Somebody that had ADD would be distracted every time a car drove by. We're distracted by every sound that happened outside. There's a little rabbit that lives like right over across the way from my window. And so I see him quite a bit out there, and somebody with ADD would be extremely distracted by that item, or the dog laying in the hallway. If he moves or scratches or gets up or anything else, again, someone with ADD couldn't block those things out and would have a very difficult time kind of sorting through and determining what, sensory information is most important. Okay, change blindness is a form of inattentional blindness in which 2/3 of individuals giving directions failed to notice a change in the individual asking for directions. Okay, so this guy is the one being tested. And this gentleman in the purple jacket comes up to him and asks him for directions on how to get somewhere. Then this guy comes by with a board and switches out the people. So now purple guy goes away and green guy stays put. And now our tester continues to give directions to a different person and doesn't notice that the person is different. Again, in terms of sensory input, he doesn't value what this particular person looks like because he's so concerned with being able to give him the appropriate directions, and he's so focused on giving him an accurate description of how to get wherever he's supposed to be going that he doesn't notice that this is a completely different person. Again, these guys look fairly similar. I mean, they both have brown hair. They look like they're similar in height. Would it be different if you switched out, the purple coated guy with like a little blonde chick? Probably. So they are fairly similar in terms of stature and size and things like that. So, that certainly would play into it. But again, you can even see from just looking at their hair that they are certainly not that close related. So, that can account for some issues as well. So we've talked about consciousness. We've talked briefly about selective attention and how we can kind of weed through the sensory information that we're receiving all the time and kind of focus in on what we perceive as important factors. Now we're going to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about sleep. So sleep is the irresistible tempter to whom we inevitably succumb. Mysteries about sleeping and dreaming have just started unraveling in sleep laboratories around the world. So again, keep in mind that this is a fairly new area of research. We certainly don't have a great grasp on, with a large amount of definition on why we need sleep. And we most definitely don't have a clear understanding of why we dream. We have several theories associated with why we think we might dream, but it's not clear to us in terms of how, for sure, we know that dreaming is an important part for us. So in terms of the physiological side of things, we have biological rhythms, also known as a circadian rhythm. And a circadian rhythm occurs basically on a 24-hour cycle, and this includes sleep and wakefulness. It's termed as our biological clock, and it can be altered by artificial light. So again, the light will stimulate the pineal gland and therefore suppress the release of melatonin. Normally when it becomes dark outside, melatonin is produced and released, and melatonin will cause us to feel drowsy. So melatonin is probably one of the most important factors for us in determining our circadian rhythm. And again, basically natural light triggers us to decrease melatonin release in the mornings, and that will allow us to wake up. Whereas melatonin release increases in the evenings, and that is what allows us to begin to feel drowsy. Okay, so in terms of what's actually happening while we are sleeping, we're going to look at the biological rhythm of our sleep. And again, we're going to kind of cycle through these various phases of sleep throughout every normal night. So each cycle or each cycle of sleep occurs every about 90 minutes as we pass through a cycle of 5 distinct phases. And we'll look at each of these phases. Again, you can see our EEG coming into effect here. These are kind of some of the things that we measure or look at in a sleep laboratory. Again, we can detect eye movements on each separate eye. We can also detect muscle tension, like if you're tightening your jaw and things like that as well. Okay, so when an individual closes his eyes but remains awake, his brain activity slows to large amplitude, slow, regular alpha waves. So a meditating person exhibits alpha brain activity. So again, large amplitude, slow, regular waves called alpha waves. And these, again, are, you're relaxed, but you're not asleep. So a meditating person might show alpha brain activity. Again, if you were doing yoga, you would experience this particular type of wave. When you're laying there and you haven't fallen asleep yet, but you're relaxed and you're almost ready to go to sleep, you would be having some alpha waves as well. Okay, so then we eventually fall asleep, and we're going to enter into stage 1, followed by stage 2. So these are early in the sleep cycle, and it's considered light sleep. So we'll first have high amplitude, slow, regular waves called theta waves. A person who's daydreaming actually experiences theta waves as well, which is kind of interesting to think about. A little bit scary, I guess, to think too that when you're daydreaming, you have the same brain activity as when you are asleep. So is daydreaming just as good as getting light sleep? I don't think so, but that certainly would help me. I feel like I daydream all the time while I'm biking or running or whatever it is I'm doing outside. I am always daydreaming, always kind of drifting my thoughts away and that sort of thing. So I hope I don't freaking crash my bike or something crazy like that, because I'm basically asleep while I'm out there. Okay, so once we've gotten through the first 2 sleep stages of light sleep, we're entering into the deepest sleep, which is stage 3 and 4, and brain activity actually slows down here. Here we have large amplitude slow waves called delta waves. So again, you can see the delta waves and the difference in those waves if you're in stage 3. Or if you're in stage 4, you can see they're even deeper or larger in this particular stage in comparison to stage 3. Also, the frequency seems to increase slightly as you move from stage 3 to stage 4. Okay, after reaching your deepest stage of sleep, which is stage 4, the sleep cycle starts moving backwards towards stage 1. So you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 1. Okay, so although still asleep, the brain engages in low amplitude, fast, regular beta waves, which are very similar actually to what we experience when we're awake. And this is called REM sleep, or rapid eye movements. So a person in this particular stage of sleep, REM sleep, is exhibiting rapid eye movements, so we can detect those in a lab, in a sleep lab. People actually report our most vivid dreams, or the only time we're really dreaming, is during REM sleep. And we'll talk about why we think that is coming up. So REM sleep is also called paradoxical sleep because the sleeper is difficult to arouse. So again, it's hard for you to wake up during this stage. And despite having an EEG characteristic of an alert awake state, it's very difficult for us to get out of REM sleep and be awakened. When awakened during REM sleep, subjects generally report that they have been dreaming. So again, if your alarm wakes you up during REM sleep, this is when you're like, oh my God, I just had the weirdest dream that this happened and blah, 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 and so was doing this or whatever. So only in your REM sleep, if you're waking up, is when you actually can remember your dreams. If uninterrupted, so if you're not woken up during REM sleep, sleep continues to occur in a cyclical fashion and tends to move from non-REM stages 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back down from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, and then an episode of REM sleep. Okay, so again, we're going to kind of move through these in a pyramid fashion, including REM sleep at the end of each of the cycles. Okay, so again, as we alluded to in a previous slide, our sleep cycles will last about 90 minutes total. And with each 90-minute cycle, stage 4 sleep decreases and the duration of REM sleep will increase. So here you can see the first time you get into REM sleep, again, you're at 90 minutes or so of sleep. Let's say you get 10 minutes of REM sleep. Then the second cycle goes through, maybe you get 14 minutes. Then the third cycle goes through and maybe you get 23 minutes. And so on. I don't know the exact numbers. I'm just kind of making that up. But you can see that REM sleep increases as we move deeper and deeper into our sleep. Okay. So again, over here, we can see the relationship between stage 4 sleep decreasing and REM sleep increasing as we move through our sleep phases or our sleep cycle. Okay. So again, this basically shows the same thing that we saw on the previous chart. So here you can see the first stage of REM sleep, maybe 10 minutes. Then we increased it to 13 minutes. Then REM sleep in our third cycle is 22 minutes. And then in the fourth cycle, it's 29 minutes or something along those lines. So again, as you continue to get into a deeper sleep, you're getting more REM sleep. Excuse me. Why do we care about getting REM sleep? What's the importance of it? Again, we've got various theories related to this. We don't exactly know for sure why it's so important to us, but we will discuss some of those theories that we have. So why do we sleep? Again, we know that REM sleep is important to us, but sleep in general is certainly important to us as well. We spend about 1/3 of our lives sleeping. If an individual remains awake for several days, immune function and concentration deteriorates, and the risk of accidents actually increases. So, for those reasons, as a preventative measure, sleep is certainly important to us. sleep deprivation, what are the, I guess, negative consequences associated with sleep deprivation? First would be cognitive and memory deficits. So we start to see some issues in terms of cognition and also with being able to store memories and also retrieve memories as well. Number 2 would be impaired concentration. Again, we have difficulty staying concentrated on a given task. Maybe you're too drowsy to do so, but concentration becomes more difficult with sleep deprivation. Number 3 would be emotional irritability. So again, you can become very crabby if you're not getting enough sleep. Number 4, depressed immune system. Again, a lot of people get sick when they are stressed because they're not getting enough sleep, and so therefore the immune system is down, and we have this increased risk for developing some sort of, or catching some sort of virus or something along those lines. Number 5, greater vulnerability. And number 6, ultimately psychosis and death. So you can die from not getting sleep if you deprive yourself. So again, let me run through those 6 things again. Make sure you get these in your notes. Number 1, cognitive and memory deficits. Number 2, impaired concentration. Number 3, emotional irritability. Number 4, depressed immune system. Number 5, greater vulnerability. And number 6, ultimately psychosis and death. So again, we know kind of the negative consequences of what happens if we don't get enough sleep. We also want to try and look to develop some theories in terms of why it is important that we are getting sleep. So in terms of sleep deprivation, again, we don't necessarily know, with certainty what sleep actually does for us in terms of good things, but we do know the negative consequences of not getting enough sleep. So these charts below are kind of interesting. This shows car accident frequency as it relates to time changes. So in the spring, we lose an hour of sleep, and you can see the Monday after the time change, there was significantly more accidents than the Monday before the time change. So here you can see this shows more accidents following the loss of sleep that particular weekend. Whereas in the fall, when you gain an hour of sleep, you can see that we got more sleep over the weekend. And so on Monday, we saw actually less car accidents in comparison to before the time change. So, we know there are a lot of factors that affect, or are negative consequences as a result of sleep deprivation. And so for those reasons, we know that it's certainly essential, but from a scientific standpoint, we don't exactly know why that is. So some of our theories related to sleep, again, these are just theories. We don't necessarily have a whole lot of scientific background to support any of these. But number 1, sleep protects. So sleeping in the darkness when predators loomed about kept our ancestors out of harm's way. So it was thought that, sleep was certainly a protective mechanism. Number 2, sleep helps us recover. There is scientific evidence to support that sleep helps us to restore and repair not only brain tissue, but also, muscle tissue and some of the other organs within the body. Sleep helps us to remember. So sleep restores and rebuilds our fading memories. So this would help us, to, for some reason, restore somehow and rebuild what we have in terms of memory. So again, this was important for us in terms of studying. It's important for you to get some sleep because that's actually when some of those things that you've been practicing or some of those things that you've been repeating over and over get put into a memory zone, basically. Another sleep theory would be sleep plays a role in the growth process. So during sleep, the pituitary gland releases growth hormone, and so we know this helps us in terms of growth processes. Older individuals release less of this particular hormone, and therefore they also sleep less. So we think there is some link between sleep and the growth process via growth hormone. Much of the sleep research now on humans is focusing on the importance of sleep for learning and memory formation. EEG studies show that during sleep, the brain experiences reactivation of neural pathways stimulated during the prior awake cycle, and that subjects deprived of sleep show less effective memory retention. So again, a lot of this research on sleep is showing that pulling an all-nighter to study is not a very effective way for us to actually learn and retain the information. It would be better to study a little bit every day, and when you sleep at night, again, that's going to help you to retain that particular type of information. So it would be better for you, again, to try and study a little bit every day as opposed to just cramming one night and staying up super late or pulling an all-nighter. Seems to be a very ineffective way. We do have a few types of sleep disorders. Insomnia is a persistent inability to fall asleep. Narcolepsy is pretty much the opposite. So this is an overpowering urge to fall asleep that may occur while we're talking or even standing up. And sleep apnea is failure to breathe when asleep. Couple more sleep disorders that children are particularly prone to, although sleepwalking and sleep talking I think can certainly occur or continue to occur later in life. Night terrors are the sudden arousal from sleep with intense fear accompanied by physiological reactions such as rapid heart rate and perspiration, which occurs during stage 4 sleep. So again, this is basically the same thing as a nightmare. You wake up, your heart is racing, you're sweaty, and something, intensely went horribly wrong within your dream or within the nightmare. Again, much more common in kids than in adults. Sleepwalking, stage 4 disorder, which is usually harmless and unrecalled the next day. So these people get up in the middle of the night, walk around, go back to bed, and they don't even know that they did it. Sleep talking, again, same sort of condition. It seems to be linked to a genetic factor somehow. Like sleepwalking, they cannot recall what happened the next day. Generally harmless in nature in terms of what they're actually saying. Some people that sleep talk don't actually make any words. They just kind of more mumble. So it's hard for someone who is around them to actually understand what it is that they're saying. So this can vary from person to person. And maybe some of you have some funny stories about your roommate does this or somebody you know does this. Or it's a pretty common thing. Coma and brain death. Coma is a severe decrease in mental function due to structural, physiological, or metabolic impairment. So brain death occurs when the brain no longer functions and has no possibility of functioning again. So a coma generally has to do with reticular formation, which is our brain's system for level of arousal, basically. When the system is completely shut off, that's when you are in a coma. Your brain is not aroused, and we don't have communication amongst these multiple areas within the brain. So motivations are processes responsible for goal-directed behavior, and a goal could be anything as simple as wanting to eat. So it doesn't have. We're not talking like just life goals. I mean, that is certainly under this umbrella, but it could be something simple as, getting something to eat that you enjoy eating. So those would be goal-directed behaviors. Emotion is the result from the relationship between the individual and the environment. So our motivation or our emotions can be very mixed from person to person. Experience to experience can, certainly play a role in how we feel about a particular situation. And that's kind of, I think, one of the most interesting things about humans as a species is this really wide array of emotions that we feel and how each individual can respond so differently to the exact same situation. So again, in terms of motivation, we're talking about, something that drives us to do something. So why are you the way that you are? Why did you come to class today? Why did you not go to class? Why do you have a job? Why are you in college? Again, all of these things are, you're motivated to do something. Maybe it's because you want to get a good job. Maybe you're in school because your parents wanted you to be. Maybe you're in school because you genuinely enjoy learning and you enjoy being in this type of environment. Maybe you came because a couple of your friends were going here as well. So, what drives us to do what we do can vary so greatly, and it can be definitely multifaceted. So, your parents wanted you to come to school, and you want to have a good job, and you wanted to meet new people and be in this new environment. So, it's certainly not a one simple answer to a lot of these complex decisions that we make. So motivation can lead to hormonal, autonomic, and behavioral responses. And primary motivated behavior is behavior that's related directly to homeostasis. So primary motivated behavior is linked directly to homeostasis, and that is the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment, such as getting up to get something to drink when you're thirsty. In many kinds of behavior, however, the relation between behavior and the primary goal is indirect. For example, we said that, if you were thirsty, that would be related to your primary motivated behavior, but your selection of a particular flavor of soft drink has little, if any, apparent relationship to homeostasis. So motivation in this case would be secondary. So again, keep in mind that all the decisions that we make are fairly complex in terms of why we do what we do. So, primary motivated behavior would be linked to homeostasis, such as eating, drinking, doing things like that. Much of human behavior fits into this latter category, which we said was secondary motivated behavior, and is influenced by habit, learning, intellect, emotions, factors that can be lumped together in the term incentives. So the concepts of reward and punishment are inseparable from motivation. So in terms of these incentives, let's think of some examples of incentives. So maybe your incentive to go to college is that, or go to this class, is that you want to get a good job. You want to have you want to go to physical therapy school and you want to have a good job so that you can make money so that you can do the things you want. That would be one of the incentives that you have to be successful in this class. On the flip side, maybe some of you just want to get through this class because you just don't want to fail it. You don't want to have to take it again. So you're motivated by kind of the punishment to not being successful in this class would be having to retake it. So, we can certainly be motivated on both sides of the spectrum. And, maybe most of the time you're thinking like, gosh, I want to really do well because I know this information will be important for me when I am a physical therapist. But there are some days where, it's all you can do to just get here because you don't want to fail the class. So, that can certainly change at different times in the course and other things like that as well. Or maybe different units are more interesting to you than others and so on and so forth. So rewards are things that organisms work for or things that make the behavior lead them to occur more often. In other words, positive reinforcement. Punishments would be the opposite of these. So again, the more you study, the better your grades are, and that kind of is a positive reinforcement for you if your goal is to be successful in this class, to continue to study more and more because you see the results of that. The more you study, the more successful you are in the class, and therefore, the more you're reaching this particular goal. Again, punishment would be negative reinforcement. Maybe you failed a class before and now you really don't want that to happen. So as a result, you're going to study more and more to make sure that you don't get yourself in that position again. Okay. So the neural system has, a lot to do with this reward and punishment idea, and this is going to be part of the reticular activating system. So in terms of chemical mediators for motivation, dopamine is a major neurotransmitter in the pathway that mediates the brain reward systems and motivation. Amphetamines are an example of a drug that's abused because they increase the release of dopamine, which gives you positive reinforcement. Again, positive reinforcement is going to, give you reward, basically. It makes you feel like you're doing the right thing to reach your goal or whatever. So, for example, when you exercise, you release dopamines, and that causes you to feel good. So as a result, a lot of people, well, not a lot, some people will continue to exercise because they like that feeling. They like feeling good. And so, it reinforces that, idea, basically. Amphetamines are commonly, like we said, going to be abused because they do the same thing. They cause this release of dopamine, and they can be very addictive because of those principles. So in terms of the pathways associated with motivation, again, you've got the prefrontal cortex. This is where a lot of our cognitive decisions are going to be made. So again, you cognitively make the decision that, hey, I'm going to be really great in this class. I'm going to do a great job, and I'm going to really focus, and I want to be really successful in this class. So that decision is made here. Again, what are the reasons that you chose this decision? Again, they can be multifaceted. Maybe it's that you don't want to fail. Maybe it's that you want to be successful in your career. Maybe it's that you're genuinely interested in this topic. Maybe you want to just make your parents proud that you did, got good grades, or whatever your goal is. Again, this is closely linked with emotional feelings. So again, when you accomplish something that was a really tough goal, it can be very emotional. Maybe you get very emotional because you've reached this goal, or vice versa. You see it all the time in sports. You can emotionally see, the physical effect of success or failure on people. If you just watch sports on TV, you can see this all over the place. Again, you go to any type of national championship event for college, you see all sorts of emotion from the athletes. Whether they're winning or losing, they had this huge goal and they've worked really hard for it. And, you can see both sides of, whether they were successful or not in terms of their emotional connection to this particular goal. Again, this system is kind of all-encompassing within the brain. It affects multiple areas within the brain. Here you can see some portions within the nuclei. These are going to be responsible for kind of our physical reactions to things that we don't necessarily have control of. So again, associated with emotion would maybe be sweating, would commonly be, different facial expressions would kind of be occurring. Changes in blood pressure and things like that could occur as a result of this system. So emotional behavior can be studied more easily than the anatomical systems or inner emotion because it includes responses that we can measure externally in terms of behavior. So again, this is a little bit out of our scope, but just to kind of give you an idea of, this would be more of a psychology type of topic. But again, we're just kind of brushing the surface here. Certain anatomical structures in the brain are responsible for emotions. For example, the amygdala is responsible for fear. Again, fear is kind of a learned trait. And so we learn to be afraid of snakes, or we learn to be afraid of spiders. Maybe your mom was afraid of spiders and so on. So we can study what you do in response to that. It's very difficult for us to study, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, blah, 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 or whatever, because it's all subjective. So do you feel happy and scared? Sure. Maybe you feel a little bit of both. Maybe you feel nervous. Maybe you feel, angry or whatever. So our emotions can certainly be within a continuum. So that makes it very difficult. The other part would be that it's so subjective in nature and so highly dependent on emotion in that particular way. So again, the amygdala is responsible for fear. Cerebral cortex plays a major role in directing many of our motor responses during emotional behavior. So, do we approach this snake? Do we run away from the snake? Do we avoid a situation that, seems to make us nervous, or do we face it head on? Again, a lot of that can be related to, what is our experience? What have we done in the past? What has worked for us before? And so on and so forth. So experience certainly plays a large role in kind of, what our response should be to that particular change. So again, as we said, the limbic system plays an important role in, motivation and certainly emotion. Keep in mind that the limbic system kind of encompasses a lot of different areas. So again, here you can see the amygdala, which is our area of fear. So fear is highly associated with emotion. Some of these other areas, so the frontal cortex is going to play an important role for us in kind of some of the cognitive decisions that we make in relation to, what you do in response to this. Hippocampus is an area of memory. So we're going to take, what has worked for us in the past or what has not worked for us in the past and use that information to make a more intentional or possibly better decision as a result. So in terms of learning and memory, learning is the acquisition and storage of information. Memory is a relatively permanent form of storage of this learned information. We'll talk about the different types of memory and the different locations in which these items can be stored. So memory can be viewed in kind of two broad categories. It could be declarative or procedural in nature. So we'll talk about each of these. Declarative memory is sometimes also referred to as explicit memory. And this is the retention and recall of conscious experiences that can therefore be put into words or declared. So examples would be facts and figures. So you can remember the Pledge of Allegiance. You can say it out loud, no problem. You can declare that particular type of information. You also know your birthday, you know your mom and dad's birthday, and you know your brother's birthdays. Again, we can easily declare that particular type of information. You know that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, blah, blah, blah. You know the year to which that happened, probably because you've learned it in the past and you've got like that handy little jingle to kind of go along with it. One example of this would be memory of having perceived an object or event and therefore recognizing it as familiar and maybe even knowing the specific time and place when this memory had originated. So you could ask your parents about the day a particular president died. They can probably remember what grade they were in school, what they were doing, what their parents' response was, what their teacher's response was, and so on and so forth. I know I'm kind of aging myself a little bit, but when 9/11 happened, I was in high school. I was like a sophomore in high school, and I can remember very vividly finding out about this. I was in marching band. It was on either a Tuesday or Thursday morning because I know I had a cross country meet that day. And they came out and told us, and I was a flag person, so we were practicing our routines there, and I can remember exactly where I was standing on the football field when we heard about 9/11. I can also remember that it was chilly that morning. I do know I had like a blue hooded sweatshirt on. Again, I don't know why I remember that part of this, situation, but for some reason, a lot of times we can recall specific places and names of where you had that memory originate. The hippocampus, amygdala, and other parts of the limbic system are required for the formation of declarative memories. So that's interesting. Again, hippocampus plays a large role in our memories. Amygdala is responsible for fear, and the limbic system is related to emotion. So if you have no emotional or kind of like way to relate this information to anything else, it can be very difficult for us to retain this type of information. So that's one of the reasons why when you're studying for this class or whatever class, it's important for us to try and make connections with this information, either emotionally to something you already know, or relate it to your sport or to your field or to exercise or to something you've learned in another class, or if it's related to cells, maybe to biology or something along those lines. If you can make a connection with information to another given topic that you already know, you're much more likely to remember that particular information. So that's one of the reasons I try and use a lot of examples from sport and injury and other things like that, is hopefully that can help you to store this information a little easier. Okay, procedural memory can be defined as the memory of how to do things. So, for example, riding a bike. Again, it's very difficult if you remember when you were a kid, or maybe you have a younger brother or sister and you can remember them trying to learn how to ride a bike. But it would be very difficult for us to say, okay, now flex your hips, and now you got to stay balanced, and now you're going to bring your left foot up, now bring your right foot up. It would be really difficult for a kid to learn how to ride a bike that way. Instead, you just have them get on and try it, and they can kind of figure it out. They will learn how to do it kind of on their own, essentially, but you can, give them tips and say, oh, you got to use your brakes here, or you got to do this or that, or whatever. But for the most part, it's just a matter of figuring out how to do it. One of the things when I first started coaching track was teaching kids how to use blocks. So again, you use blocks at the start of a lot of like sprint races and things like that. And when I was in high school and when I started learning how to use blocks, it was just kind of second nature. You just get down there and you push out. You just got to try it and figure it out. So that was one thing I really struggled with when I started coaching, was all the things that were easy to me, like using blocks and going over hurdles, with fairly decent form. You just kind of have to figure it out. There's not a great way for me to tell you the basics of that, or it's very difficult for me personally to put those things in words. I would rather have the kid try it, and then I can help make corrections as we go. But for me, it makes more sense to, if I have kids that are, 8th graders and they want to try hurdles for the first time, I just have them go over them a few times and kind of figure it out on their own. And then once they start to kind of get the gist of it, then I can start making corrections and help them with their form and technique and things like that. Because for me, it's so procedural in nature. And the other part probably that makes it difficult is if it comes easy to you, it's very difficult for us to be able to explain how to do it to someone else because it was simple to you. So someone that struggles with kind of getting those basic concepts, it could be very difficult for you as someone who's more experienced to be able to explain that. So a lot of times it's just a matter of kind of trial and error and kind of figure it out. Again, it's difficult for us to explain to someone how to ride a bike. It'd be easier for us to show them and then they try and see if they can't figure it out as well. So this memory for skilled behavior, such as riding a bike, is independent of our conscious understanding. Again, it's very difficult for us to put it in words because it's kind of outside of our conscious understanding or our ability to put it into an explanation, essentially. So a category of procedural memory also includes learned emotional responses, such as fear of spiders. Again, you were not born afraid of spiders. Okay, fear is not something that you're born with; it's something that you learn. So maybe you saw your mom jump and she was scared of a spider, so you learned that that's the appropriate response to the spider. The other example would be Pavlov's dogs, and maybe you've heard of this if you have taken a psychology class, but basically they taught these dogs that if they ring a bell, then they would get food. and they, did this multiple times. And the dogs would salivate when they heard the bell because they knew they were getting food next. And so then, after a while, even without the presence of food, the dogs would start to salivate as a response to this bell because they learned to associate these two things together. The primary areas in the brain involved with procedural memory are the regions of the sensory motor cortex, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum. The cerebellum serves as our location for storage of kind of like muscle memory things. So, for example, the program needed to ride a bike would be stored in this particular area. The sensory motor cortex would allow us to respond or kind of alter this motor memory plan depending on the situation. So, for example, if you're going up a hill on a bike, maybe I need to push harder and adjust that motor plan while I move my feet, or maybe I need to stand up on my bike. So again, sensory motor cortex would provide us with the feedback necessary so that we can make the appropriate decision that way. So another possible way that we can classify memory is in terms of duration. So we can look at memory in terms of short term. Short term is going to register and retain incoming information for a short time. This could be a matter of seconds or up to minutes after its input, again, just depending on the situation. And then also long-term memories. Short-term memories can be converted into long-term, which would be stored for from days to years and recalled at a later time. Of course, the more often you recall information, the kind of, I guess, more ingrained it becomes in your long-term memory. So in terms of, retaining information in a class or something, the more often you can repeat the information, the more likely it is that that information will get converted from short-term to long-term memory. The process of consolidation is when we take these short-term memories and they become long-term memories. So consolidation is the process by which short-term memories become long-term memories. And again, the more repetitions we have with a given memory or concept, the more likely it is that consolidation can occur. That's why probably the most important factor about memorizing information is continuous repetition. And you can do repetition in a variety of ways. It seems like, doing repetition in a variety of ways would enhance our ability to remember it as well. So, for example, if you're studying for this class, it would be great for you to listen to this information that you're being provided right now. It would also be good for you to write notes. So physically writing helps with memory. And then in terms of recall of that given information, it would help you to read over your notes, also rewriting your notes, creating note cards so you can test yourself that way, explaining this information to your friend or your roommate or something along those lines is another way for us to recall this information and kind of enhance our likelihood that it will be consolidated. In terms of neural basis of learning and memory, the neural mechanism and parts of the brain involved vary for different types of memory. So again, this has to do with not only the procedural and declarative memory, but also short and long-term memory. So short-term encoding and long-term memory storage occur in different areas of the brain. Again, like we mentioned, for declarative and procedural memories both. So working memory is susceptible to external interface, such as an attempt to learn conflicting information. So again, if you, learn something in another class that conflicts with, what you're learning in this class, that can cause some major conflicts in terms of your ability to memorize this given information. However, it does seem that if you can make connections with this information into, something in your own life or something you've learned in another class, or somehow apply it to, something that you're going to be doing in the work environment, it's more likely that we can have the capacity to memorize these things. On the other hand, Long-term memory, it seems once you have long-term memory, this can survive deep anesthesia, trauma, electroconvulsive shock, all which would disrupt the normal patterns of neural conduction within the brain. So in terms of how are memories actually made? The problem of exactly how memories are stored in the brain seems pretty much still unsolved. One possible kind of theory or model for memory is this idea of long-term potentiation. And with long-term potentiation, certain synapses undergo a long-lasting increase in their effectiveness if they're heavily used. So again, this is the idea of that constant recall or more frequent recall would kind of increase the use of certain pathways, and so therefore increase their effectiveness because they're used heavily. This involves a few different processes. So translation is the production of new proteins, also called protein synthesis. Increased synapses. So new proteins are involved in making new connections. Again, as I've mentioned several times throughout this lecture, the more connections you can make with various other concepts and various other things that you know and understand, the more likely things will be long-term potentiated. Okay. This requires some plasticity in order to activate new neural changes. So it's very likely that our brain is this kind of plastic figure that can be manipulated and changed. New connections can always be created, doesn't matter how old you are. We're never too old to learn. So we can always continue to learn and to develop these pathways, at least according to this theory and at least according to some of the trends in terms of research associated with memory. So certain types of learning depend not only on factors such as attention, motivation. Do you see value in understanding or learning this information? Do you have the attention span? Is this lecture too long? And so therefore now you can't focus on what you're learning, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of factors. Also various neurotransmitters, but also hormones as well. So epinephrine, ACTH, ADH, and endorphin are all going to play a role in this capacity, essentially. So, for example, like we said, the hormones epinephrine, ACTH, and vasopressin affect the retention of learned experiences. These hormones are normally released in stressful or even mildly stimulating experiences, suggesting that the hormonal consequences of our experiences affect our memories of them. So, again, under a stressful situation, it's likely that we are going to remember things differently than if you are in an unstressful situation. Two of the opioid peptides, one of them being enkephalin and the other being endorphin, interfere with memory and learning as well, particularly when the lesson involves a painful stimuli. We actually have the ability to kind of eliminate that painful stimuli from the memory that we create associated with whatever that experience is. So they may inhibit learning simply because they decrease the emotional component, such as like fear and anxiety. So they decrease the emotional component of the painful experiences associated with learning, and therefore can decrease the motivation necessary for learning to occur. It turns out in terms of the cerebral cortex that there are some asymmetries amongst either side. So the two cerebral hemispheres appear to be nearly symmetrical, but each has its own anatomical, chemical, and functional specializations. So, for example, the left hemisphere focuses on production of language. Conceptualization of writing and speaking can occur on the left side. Again, language is a complex code that includes the act of listening, seeing, reading, and speaking. The major centers for language function are in the left hemisphere, within the temporal, parietal, and frontal cortexes. And 90% of the population, the left hemisphere is said to be specialized for language production, the conceptualization of what one wants to say or to write, and the neural control of the act of speaking, writing, or recent verbal memory. So again, all of these things are going to take place on the left side. For example, in most people, if you had some sort of damage to the left cerebral hemisphere, whether it be through a stroke or some sort of car accident or something along those lines, a tumor. So if it only affects the left cerebral hemisphere and not the right, this might interfere with the capacity for language manipulation, and damage to different areas of the left cerebral hemisphere might affect language usage differently. So again, if we have some sort of injury to the left side of the brain, it's likely that language, speech, writing, those would be some of the components that would be greatly affected. It turns out males and females typically use different areas of the brain for language processing. Females tend to involve areas of both hemispheres for language tasks, while males are going to generally show activity only on the left side. So a male with a left cerebral injury would probably have a greater amount of damage in comparison to a female, because a female tend to have some sort of processing occurring on both sides of the brain. Memories are actually handled differently in the two cerebral hemispheres as well. So verbal memories are more likely to be associated on the left hemisphere, where non-verbal memories, such as like visual things, so if you feel like you're a visual learner and you look at a question on an exam and you can like picture in your notes where exactly the answer is and what color pen you had written that answer in, that would be considered a non-verbal memory, and that will be stored on the right hemisphere. Even the emotional responses of the two hemispheres seem to be different. So for example, the left hemisphere has more of an ability to understand the emotional states of oneself or others. So the left hemisphere, again, to kind of reiterate, is going to be more related to verbal memories, comprehension of the emotional state, whereas the right hemisphere is more associated with visual patterns. So again, being able to remember where on a piece of paper, if you think you're a visual learner, where on a piece of paper something is written. Also, depression and therapy will occur on the right side. So again, as we said, memories are handled differently in both two hemispheres. The two sides differ in sensitivity to drugs as well. So again, to kind of reiterate what we previously mentioned, the left side has our storage of verbal memories and comprehension of emotional state, where the right hemisphere is going to contain visual patterns, also depression and therapy as well.